Okay, David, let's go through the requirements for the LCSW.
The LCSW is based on an individual who is going to want to practice psychotherapy, engage in diagnosis, and provide those types of clinical services. To become an LCSW, an individual first needs to be licensed as an LMSW in New York. That's how they legally get experience. Anytime during the 3 years or more that they're working to get their experience, they can submit their application for the LCSW. They can have their graduate school submit their verification of their education so we can determine if they had the content required under the law for the clinical license. And then as they complete the experience, their supervisor submits documentation that they've completed hours. They need at least 36 months and 2,000 client contact hours in diagnosis, in psychotherapy, and assessment-based treatment planning under a qualified supervisor. And when that is approved then by the board, then we will make them eligible for the exam. So while they're still an LMSW, still practicing under supervision, they've met the experience and the education requirements, they can take the clinical exam then. And when they get that license, they will then have actually 2 licenses, one for the LMSW and one for the LCSW.
Okay. Now, Karen, given the 2 licenses, are there actions that should be taken as a social work student to prepare for social work licensure?
Well, there are definitely decisions to be made early on in your social work career as a student, and that being, do you want to pursue a clinical track or more of a management advocacy track? If you hope to provide services as a clinical social worker, you need to be cognizant of the fact that there are 12 semester hours that are focused specifically on clinical core content that must be completed at the master's level prior to graduation and prior to applying for your LCSW. So every once in a while we'll get a call from somebody who's gone to school years ago, they were on the macro track and they don't have the clinical core content. And the answer to the question is, do I have to go back and get it, is yes. You must complete those 12 semester hours of clinical core content, become an LCSW.
Okay. David, can you follow up on, let's add a little bit to that statement for folks who have already graduated and may not have that clinical content. How, can they still be licensed? How do they go about that?
The law and our regulations allow an individual who's got an MSW degree to apply for the license. As Karen said, if we find that their clinical content is missing, we'll notify them of that, and then they can go back, and most every school of social work in New York State will consider admitting them as a non-matriculated student. So they can complete the specific coursework that they need. So
Okay.
They don't need to get a new degree, they just need to get the additional graduate coursework from the degree granting program that we then combine with their basic or first MSW degree, so they meet the content requirements.
Okay. And what about their clinical experience? Does that have to be completed after they've already done this clinical coursework, if they need to go back and do that?
Well, the law allows an LMSW to engage in clinical practice under supervision. So they very well could have engaged in several years of clinical practice under a qualified supervisor. It could be a question, though, for the individual if they never took a course in psychopathology and previously provided services. Now they've taken that course, they might have a different understanding of psychopathology as it relates to the practice of social work, and they might want to wait and get more experience after completing that additional coursework. But that's something we leave up to them and to their supervisor.
Okay. All right. Now, Karen, what exactly is in the scope of practice for the LMSW?
Well, once you're an LMSW, you will first receive your license parchment and registration certificate, and you can practice as an LMSW without further licensure and provide the services within that scope of the LMSW, which include case management, community organizing, advocacy, planning and administration, and supportive counseling. And as David just mentioned, an LMSW can provide clinical services as well, such as psychotherapy. However, they must do it under the supervision, under appropriate supervision.
And in an authorized setting.
And in an authorized setting, absolutely.
Okay. And David, can you review the scope of practice for the LCSW?
Well, the scope of practice for the LCSW starts with the LMSW, and it encompasses everything that an LMSW can do, because those are all critical parts of social work practice as well. But then it also adds the development and implementation of appropriate assessment-based treatment plans based on the social worker's assessment of the client and the determination of services that are needed, provision of psychotherapy, both short-term and long-term, that could include psychoanalysis or other modalities, again, based on the training and the competence of the clinical social worker. And all of these activities, as well as the diagnosis of mental illness, other conditions using the DSM, they're all related to the practice of social work and addressing what is defined as clinical social work practice in New York, so that the individual is providing psychotherapy as is recognized under the law, and they've met standards for specialized training in that area beyond what they had just for their MSW, for general LMSW practice.
Okay. Now, Karen, since the LMSW can only practice clinical social work under appropriate supervision, can you outline the criteria of what constitutes appropriate clinical supervision?
Sure. Appropriate supervision, clinical supervision, must be performed first and foremost by an LCSW, a licensed psychologist, or a psychiatrist. The amount of supervision is an aggregation of 100 hours over the 2,000 hours of clinical experience. But two very noteworthy things here, Celicia, that the supervisor is legally responsible for each of the cases of the supervisee, and they're also responsible to maintain the appropriate records of such cases.
Okay. And David, what happens if a social worker works in an agency that doesn't have an appropriate clinical supervisor in-house? Can they contract out for supervision?
Well, the first question to be asked is, if the agency does not have a qualified supervisor, is the agency really ready to be providing psychotherapy and those services? So that might be something that the agency needs to look at first, as well as the social worker who's considering that setting. The second thing is, if they don't have a qualified supervisor on site, the agency can contract with a licensed clinical social worker, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist to provide that supervision. As Karen said, that supervisor is responsible for each one of the clients that's seen and for the activities of the LMSW who's practicing under supervision. So clients need to know that the supervisor is responsible for that patient. The agency needs to know that an outside party is responsible for directing the care of those patients. If a social worker were to make those type of arrangements on his or herself, by himself or herself, without telling the client, without telling the agency, it raises a lot of liability questions for the agency and for the professionals who are involved, as well as the patient, who should know who is really directing the services and to make sure that they are the appropriate services.
And the clinical supervisor would need to have access to, clinical client information, and so there's confidentiality, and clients would need to give
their consent for that, exactly.
Okay, all right. And now let's touch base on the issue of authorized practice settings. David, can you explain what this is?
Well, the law, since the LMSW and the LCSW are both independently licensed, the law would allow me as an LMSW to set up a practice to provide services within the LMSW scope. So I could set up a practice doing community organizing, policy, management, administration type of consulting. I could not do clinical social work, though, in my own private practice because I'm not authorized to practice that. Even though I can do that under supervision, I'm not authorized, so I still can't have a practice to provide that. I could be employed, though, if I wanted to get clinical experience, by a licensed clinical social worker or licensed psychologist or licensed psychiatrist who would be responsible for the patients and assigning me work and supervising my professional development. I could be employed by a professional corporation set up by someone in one of those professions where they've got a qualified supervisor on board. And there's various types of professional corporations that individuals can set up. I could be in a facility that's approved by the Office of Mental Health or the Department of Health, the Office of Children and Family Services, where clinical services are provided to individuals, families, groups, and the LCSW would be getting an appropriate supervision. One of the issues that we found since we started implementing this law is that there are many community-based organizations and not-for-profits that, before there was a licensing law, employed social workers and others to provide psychotherapy and services that really were not within their authority, that once we implemented a licensing law, only licensed persons could provide those services. So that created a little crunch and the need for additional legislation to try and address those problems of what we call the corporate practice of a profession, which is prohibited, whether the business is a for-profit or a not-for-profit.
Okay. Karen, can you, how can someone determine whether they're in an authorized setting or practicing in a legal setting?
Well, the State Education Department actually has developed a prospective review mechanism. Beginning in 2010, LMSW can submit Form 6, which they can also find on the State Education Department's website, basically to determine if the experience completed there would be appropriate for licensure as an LCSW, as opposed to getting all the way to the end and putting their application in and hoping for the best. If the state board has questions, if questions pop up regarding the application related to the setting and whether or not it should be authorized or not, the LMSW will be notified of such questions and they will be asked to provide further clarification. It's a relatively easy process.
Okay. All right. Another question that we get is whether experience completed under a limited permit is acceptable.
An individual who's got a limited permit to practice licensed master social work can practice the profession under supervision. So if they've got a limited permit and the supervisor is qualified, that is, they're an LCSW and the individual's providing psychotherapy, then that would be acceptable experience just as if they completed it if they were licensed as an LMSW under a qualified supervisor.
Okay, great.